Have you ever looked into the eyes of something you thought was a monster and realized it understood exactly what you were about to do? I was 43, rifle raised, deep in the Shasta woods, leading a fake Bigfoot hunt for city folks who paid for thrills. And then, through the fog, I saw it. Not a myth, not a bear. A being standing tall, covered in dark fur, with human eyes. Eyes that looked back through my scope, not with fear, but with awareness. I pulled the trigger. It didn't die, but something inside me did. That night shattered everything I thought I knew. I spent the next 7 years searching, not for a trophy, but for redemption. And when I found her again, she was dying, but her children were alive. And I made a promise I'd never break again. This isn't a story about a creature. It's about a second chance, about choosing not to shoot, about raising what you once tried to destroy. So, before we dive deeper, I want to know, where are you watching from? And more importantly, what's your name, dear friend? Because stories like this, they're not meant to stay hidden in the woods. They're meant to travel, across mountains, across cities, and into the hearts of people who believe there's more to the world than what we see. If this story moved you even a little, consider liking the video and subscribing to this channel. Together, let's build a community that doesn't just believe in Bigfoot, but stands to protect the mystery, the wild, and everything still worth believing in. And to you, wherever you are, thank you for being here. You're part of this now. Late summer, 1979. The fire cracked low, spitting sap into the night air like small fireworks no one bothered to watch. Shadows of whiskey bottles stretched long across the pine needle floor, mingling with the curling smoke. 4 men laughed too loud and too hard, like boys pretending not to hear their own aging in the echo. The trees loomed, quiet witnesses. Somewhere past them, the mountain watched. Grady Larkin stood off to the side, not laughing. His face was still and unreadable, eyes fixed on something that wasn't the fire, wasn't the whiskey, wasn't even the men he'd guided out here. It was beyond them, past the heat, past the comfort, deep into the ink-black timberline. His hand rested near the rifle, but not on it. Not yet. He wasn't always this quiet. Years back, Grady had been the loudest man at the lodge, pouring bourbon and stories like water. He knew every trail through the Shasta Trinity by memory, could gut a deer in under 3 minutes, could charm even the grumpiest paying customer into a smile with stories of the mountain ghosts and howls that didn't belong to wolves. But that was before the silence settled into his bones like ash after a burn, before the house grew cold and the pictures on the mantel started gathering dust, before the boy stopped writing. Now he played the part, still wore the boots, still strapped the rifle, still gave the speech about respecting nature, but not so much you let it bite ya. The men he brought out here didn't know it was all just air now. Hollow. The old taxidermy trophies on the walls of the Sawtooth Lodge. Elk, bobcat, a bear with chipped teeth and glassy eyes. They used to mean something. They used to be real. He used to believe in conquest. Then he buried his wife, and somewhere in that grave he left the last part of himself that believed in winning. They'd begged for something big, something rare, a legend. The youngest of them, maybe mid-20s, had clutched a glossy copy of a tabloid with a headline that screamed, "Shasta ape spotted again." The older man, a surgeon from Dallas, had waved a check and grinned. "Don't matter if it's real, just make it move. We'll handle the rest." Grady knew the drill. Lead them out after dark, shake a few branches, bang on a tree, maybe arrange for a helper to hoot like a madman in the distance. Send them home with a blurry photo and a sense of danger. They'd pay double. But something shifted when the air cooled that night. A strange quiet fell just past the tree line, thicker than fog. Grady scanned it through the scope, slowly, breathing steady, hands remembering the rhythm, even if the heart behind them didn't. Then he saw it. Not movement, not shape, a presence, standing upright, shoulders broad, Fur deep brown with streaks of silver in the moonlight. The face, no snout, no muzzle, no slack-jawed beast. It had a nose, a forehead, cheekbones, lips slightly parted like it had just been breathing hard, and eyes. They stared into the scope like they knew exactly what it was, as if it wasn't glass and metal but a mirror. And somehow, it looked not scared, but disappointed. Grady's breath caught. He dropped the scope, blinked hard. When he looked again, it hadn't moved. Behind him, the clients were laughing, whispering bets. "Come on, Larkin, give us the show." "I'll double your cut if you hit it." They didn't see the eyes. Grady raised the rifle again, slower this time. His finger hovered near the trigger. He didn't believe in monsters. He believed in lighting, in shadow, in people seeing what they wanted. He'd staged too many sightings to fall for one himself. But this thing, this being, wasn't made for tabloids. It didn't belong in the photos on lodge walls. Still, he pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the forest, louder than thunder. The figure stumbled, twisting as the bullet tore through its right shoulder. It staggered back, one arm limp. Blood darkened the fur in heavy lines. But it didn't flee. Not right away. It looked at him again, not hatred, not pain, something more haunting. "You knew," its eyes said. "You looked at me and knew, and still you chose this." Then it turned and disappeared into the trees, one step at a time, trailing blood like thread, unwinding from a tapestry. The men erupted in cheers. The young one whooped. The Texan clapped Grady on the back. "You damn old legend. That was something." They wanted to chase it. Grady told them no, said it was a bear, said it was injured but too dangerous to track at night. They didn't push him. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the way he stood, too still, staring after the thing he'd shot like it might come back and say something unforgivable. They drank themselves to sleep in the lodge, shouting old jokes that echoed off the empty walls. Grady sat alone on the porch, the stars cold above him. He saw her again. Not the creature, but his wife. The way she used to look at him when he chose another weekend in the woods over a movie, a dance, a quiet breakfast. That slow disappointment. He'd spent a lifetime thinking silence meant peace. But he was wrong. Silence remembered. He walked inside and pulled down the framed photos. The fakes. The ones he'd doctored. Men in ghillie suits blurred just right. Shadows staged between trees. He burned them all in the fireplace, one by one, until only smoke and guilt remained. He made no promises out loud, just a silent one to the dark. He would find her again, if she lived. Not to hunt, not to prove, but to return something unnamed. And he would never bring another soul back to that place. Never again let laughter drown out the sound of a mistake. 7 years later, he would keep that promise. But the forest wouldn't give her back. It would give him something else. 2 small cries, barely human, echoing from beneath the rotting floorboards of a forgotten lodge. Early autumn, 1986. The kind of afternoon where the sun hangs low but stubborn, painting gold over the ridges of Shasta like it's trying to hide the coming cold. Grady Larkin moved slowly along the narrow trail. Boots crunching over the brittle needles of pine, clipboard tucked under one arm, a pencil behind his ear worn down to a nub. His uniform shirt had faded to the color of dry sagebrush, and the patch on his shoulder, U.S. Forest Service, was fraying at the edges. But the man still walked like he knew every turn of this land by instinct, like muscle memory kept him upright long after the mission had changed. He stopped to jot something down near a half-buried trap someone had laid illegally. A small smear of fur caught on the teeth. Coyote, maybe. Or something trying not to be seen. He didn't write that part. Just a note. Check again next rain. Reset boundary markers. For most folks, Willow Flats was just a dot on the map, between nowhere and forgotten. But for Grady, it was all that was left. He lived alone now, in a cabin on the edge of a meadow too wide for its silence. No trophies on the walls, just old maps, a coffee tin of dried lavender, and a dog-eared photo of a woman smiling at something out of frame. His days were predictable. Patrol the lines, check traps, scold hunters who thought the law didn't walk this deep. He kept to himself and kept things quiet. Until someone said the name, Sawtooth Lodge. He stood there on the trail longer than he meant to, pencil pausing mid-scribble, like the word itself had been pulled out of the dirt and held up to the light after all these years. A decade nearly, and still it could twist in his chest like a thorn that never healed right. It was Riley Boone who brought it up, breathless and wired, half mud from the knees down, eyes darting like he'd run from something more than cows. Said he was moving a herd along the old fire road, the one that passed by the abandoned hunting lodge. Claimed he'd heard something. No, more than something. A scratching, a dragging, a sound that was too soft to be a bear, too rhythmic to be wind. Like crying, he said, like a kid under the floorboards. Nina Alvarez stood nearby, arms crossed, not buying any of it, but not brushing it off either. She was maybe late 20s, tough, clear-eyed. She'd only been in Willow Flats a year, but already knew the rhythm of the place better than most. Grady liked her, even when she pushed. Maybe especially when she pushed. She'd already gone out once with 2 of the rookies. Checked the site. No sign of entry, no footprints, just broken glass, droppings, and a strong smell of mold and mouse piss. She'd assumed it was rodents. Maybe a raccoon nest. But the space beneath the concrete foundation was tight. 30 centimeters at most. Too small for a man, too deep for a raccoon. Grady listened, didn't say much. Then Riley said it again. Sawtooth. The sound came from under the old Sawtooth Lodge. And Grady flinched. He didn't argue, didn't explain. Just turned on his heel and said, "We're going." The road to Sawtooth hadn't improved with time. The path had narrowed, grown thick with blackberry vines and saplings that bent back with a snap as they passed. The wood around the lodge had gone soft, eaten by years and winter rot. Windows gaped like open mouths, frames splintered. The roof sagged like a dying animal trying to sleep. Whatever it had once been, back when the whiskey flowed and the walls bragged about fake beasts, it wasn't anymore. Now it was a carcass. Inside, the air hung dense with mildew and dust. The wooden floor creaked with every step. Somewhere behind the silence, they heard it. Soft, like a breath held too long. Then came a scratch, then another. A slow drag, then stillness. They moved as a group across the floor, flashlights cutting weak paths through the murk. It was Nina who found the crack. A split in the floorboards, barely wide enough to fit a hand through, but it stretched long, like the bones of the building had given up resisting whatever weight had been pressed upon them. Grady knelt, listened. There it was again, not growling, not whining, crying. Not words, not language, but the same rhythm, same pleading note. He lowered the beam of his flashlight into the crack. 2 reflections blinked back. Not from glass, from eyes. He felt his stomach twist. Not fear, not shock. Recognition. He didn't speak it. Not yet. Riley backed away. "That ain't no dog," he whispered. The younger rangers started talking logistics. Break open the floor, bring in proper equipment, do it the right way tomorrow morning. Maybe even call the county, chain of command, legal responsibility. All the usual sentences that made people feel safer in their distance. But Grady just stared down at the dark. The smell rising from below was complex. Layers of decay and fur, rust and ammonia. But something else too. Like tree bark after rain. Like something half wild, half known. The clouds outside were shifting. The light in the room dimmed a few shades more. "If it storms tonight," he said, "that crack's gonna fill like a basin." No one responded. He set down his clipboard, pulled off his jacket, flattened himself belly first onto the boards, arm outstretched. His hand hovered just above the opening. "You don't have to do this," Nina said quietly, her voice suddenly different. He didn't look at her. "If there's something down there that needs to tear into a man just to live another few minutes," he murmured, "I'll let it be me." Then he reached in, And the dark welcomed him. The first touch wasn't soft. It was claws, small, jagged, sharp. They slashed at the glove. Then came the teeth, thin, needle-like, puncturing leather, then skin. He didn't flinch, just breathed. He whispered something about rainwater, about wildflowers his wife once grew in a patch of sun behind the house, about the dog that led him out of the woods the year he nearly froze. Stories unspooling like rope, gentle and slow. The more he spoke, the less the biting hurt. It wasn't that they stopped. It was that they listened. Nina stood nearby, crouched low, watching his face. The light flickered across his jawline, showing a softness she hadn't seen before. A man who used to shoot first, now bleeding into rotted floorboards and asking forgiveness without saying the word. He pushed a half-empty water bottle into the crack. Nothing. Then, movement. Something wet touched his hand. A tongue. Quick, then gone. Then a new bite, this one clumsy, like anger had returned. He smiled anyway. You're allowed to be mad. As the sun dropped behind the trees, they made a plan. Flashlights dimmed. The lodge grew colder. Grady didn't pull his arm back, just kept it there, offering. Hours passed. At last, something shifted. A hand, small, furred, trembling. It touched his wrist. Not attacking, not escaping, just checking, feeling, daring. Then came the eyes, wide brown-black, framed by fur that looked too soft for this world. The creature crawled out slowly, painfully. Shoulders hunched, ribs visible. A child, but not human. Not bear. A shape born of stories told too late at night. Behind it, another pair of eyes. Larger, protective. Not ready yet. Grady's breath caught. The second one wouldn't come out. Just watch from the dark. But he knew. Knew them both. The little one bore a tuft of pale fur on her chest. Curved, almost crescent-shaped. The same place he remembered the blood soaking through all those years ago. The larger one had her eyes. They were her children. He didn't need proof. He had the eyes. He gathered them gently, whispering to them as if they were flame about to die. Held the smaller one first, cradling her weight as she trembled. The second growled, then followed, never taking its gaze off him. Outside, the sky opened up and rain began to fall. He walked out of Sawtooth like a man carrying judgment in his arms. The rain washed the blood from his glove, but not from his memory, not from the place where a bullet once chose to speak for him. And the forest, for the first time in years, whispered back. The leather glove split at the seam where the thumb met the palm. Grady didn't pull away. Blood welled in the soft tear of skin beneath, warmed quickly by the heat pressing from below the cracked floorboards. The gnashing hadn't stopped, not really. It had just changed. Softer now, uncertain. The teeth weren't attacking anymore. They were testing. Like the creatures down there couldn't quite believe someone had reached in just to be touched. He whispered to the dark, voice low and steady. The kind of voice you use to calm a horse that's just thrown a shoe. It wasn't the words themselves. He could have been reciting grocery lists or weather patterns. It was the rhythm, the giving of breath to fill the silence. And they listened. One of them let out a sound that was halfway between a cough and a growl, thick and wet. The second hadn't made a noise since the initial frenzy, but Grady could feel them both down there, one against his wrist, the other hanging just beyond reach, pulsing with suspicion. He adjusted his body slightly on the warped floorboards, easing pressure off his chest. Nina hovered just behind him, flashlight drawn tight in her grip, beam pinned on the gap where his arm disappeared into the shadows. Her jaw was clenched hard enough to pulse. "You're still bleeding," she said, almost a whisper. "I know," he murmured. "Let him feel it." The air below smelled like old tin and spoiled meat, like something once living had been stuck too long without choice. There was another layer too, mossy, almost cedar-like, soaked through with damp earth and something faintly sweet, like mushrooms growing on the base of a rotting stump. The smell of a thing that had once belonged outside, now trapped inside too long. Grady kept talking. About nothing. About everything. How his wife used to leave clumps of lavender around the house to keep the mice away. How he once went 4 days without water, lost in the back country before an old coonhound named Dutch found him sleeping beneath a downed pine. How he never could figure out what Dutch saw that day, but he always wondered if it was something more than bear prints. Each time he paused, the air would stiffen. A paw would twitch. A low grumble would bubble up from under the floor. So he kept talking, and they kept listening. The blood had started dripping now. It made small taps on the dry wood. He didn't mind. The pain grounded him. Nina crouched beside him eventually, wiping sweat from his neck with the sleeve of her jacket. She didn't say much, just sat there, holding onto the edge of his boot, as if that tether might keep the rest of him from being swallowed whole. Hours passed. The light shifted across the room in slow degrees, going from golden to gray to something almost blue. Outside, the trees swayed against the thickening sky. A storm was settling in, just like he'd guessed. He pulled his arm out briefly, only to wipe the blood from his fingers. The glove was useless now. His hand looked mangled, torn in several places, and yet, somehow steady. He slipped it back in, this time bare, slow, unthreatening. Then it happened. A flash of warmth against his wrist. A tongue, small, dry, cautious. It flicked once across the crease of his skin, then vanished. Then, just as quickly, teeth again. Not to injure, to punish. As if the creature regretted its own softness, as if it hated itself for having hope. Grady winced but didn't flinch. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You can hate me for a while longer." A noise came next, something like a gasp, but higher pitched. He couldn't name it, but it sounded like sorrow. Then the smallest of them moved. He felt the weight first, a tentative press against his forearm. Then the slow, clumsy drag of a body trying to navigate up toward the light. The boards above shifted under his chest as the creature climbed, inch by inch, toward the broken world above. Nina saw her first. A small, furred shape emerging into the flashlight beam. Thin, trembling, with matted patches of hair and a crusted snout that sniffed at the air as if it didn't quite belong here. She was no taller than a medium dog, but upright, with limbs shaped not unlike a child's. Long fingers, opposable thumbs, padded palms. She paused just past the crack, eyes squinting hard in the low light. Her mouth was parted, showing sharp but imperfect teeth. One side of her face was bruised, swollen. Grady reached out slowly and placed his open hand on the ground between them. She stared. Then she reached out too. Not to take, to compare. Her fingers, blackened with grime, stretched across the floor, hovering just above his. Then she placed them down gently, first on the boards, then on his scarred palm. She traced the edge of a wound, then tapped it, twice, almost like she was counting. Then she touched her own chest, where a tuft of fur curved into a white crescent just left of center. Grady stared. That mark, he remembered it. It had been soaked in blood when he saw it last. 7 years ago. There was movement behind her. Another set of hands braced the floor's edge. He came up slower, taller, broader. His fur was darker, coarser, and his chest was puffed out in silent warning. He placed himself between the girl and Grady, lowering his head, issuing a sound so low it barely registered in the human ear. Grady didn't move. "I know who you are," he whispered. The boy didn't answer, but he didn't lunge either. He stood his ground, watching the man who reeked of rust and forest and something else, something familiar. He could smell the echo of a wound left on someone else's body, the kind of scent that lingers across time and species. Grady opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. Just breath. The girl, Amma, climbed into his arms without permission. She was light, but not weightless. Every part of her trembled with dehydration and weakness. but she curled into his chest like a thing that had already made its decision. The boy Tal snarled and reached for her. Grady stepped back once, gave the boy space, but didn't flinch. "She's okay," he said. "You come too." Tal hesitated, nostrils flaring. Then he followed, keeping his shoulder to Grady's hip like a shadow ready to strike. Outside, Riley had returned with a tarp and a bundle of wool blankets. He froze when he saw what they carried. No one spoke. No one needed to. The forest around them hushed itself like it was listening to the sound of breath that shouldn't have lasted this long. Grady wrapped Amma in a blanket, tucking her tiny hands beneath her chin. Tal refused to be wrapped. He followed on foot, eyes never leaving Grady's silhouette. The wind picked up, rain spat sideways. The truck door creaked open. Grady laid Amma across the back seat gently, Tal climbing in beside her with a thump. The boy hissed as the door shut, more instinct than malice. Then silence again. Grady stood by the truck for a moment, letting the rain soak through his shirt. His hands, red and shaking, rested on the edge of the open window. He looked back at the lodge. It had collapsed more than he remembered. The windows broken, the floor split, the air inside too heavy with ghosts. He had brought them there once, to kill what he didn't understand. Now he was bringing them out, to save what remained of her. He didn't say goodbye, just stared for a moment longer, then slid into the driver's seat, engine rumbling to life beneath the storm. The road was slick. The headlights barely reached the bends ahead. But inside the cab, two beings clung to life. Not in cages, not in traps, but in wool blankets, and a kind of fragile silence Grady swore to protect. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other hovering just behind the seat, as if the contact might somehow keep them tethered. He didn't know where this road was going anymore, but for the first time in 7 years, he knew he wasn't driving away from something. He was driving toward it. The headlights carved through the rain like a blade, long streaks of light shivering across the slick mountain road. Grady's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, but not from the winding curves or the mud that kept sucking at the tires. It was the breath he kept hearing behind him, ragged, wet, shallow. Amma lay curled in the nest of an old wool blanket, eyes half shut, her chest hitching with every inhale like her lungs weren't sure if they should keep going. Tal sat beside her, silent, back braced against the truck door, shoulders hunched like he was ready to claw the world in half if it came closer. Riley had taken the passenger seat, quiet for once, biting his nails down to nothing. Nina sat half-turned in the cab's extended seat, checking Amma's pulse every few seconds, whispering things even she didn't believe would help. Grady didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the road, on the wet curves, on the slapping wipers, on the glowing yellow sign that finally appeared around the bend. Shasta Ridge Veterinary Clinic, 2MI. He hadn't even thought of Helen Price in years. But tonight, she was the only name that made sense. The building sat on the edge of town, tucked between a closed feed store and a wide field of nothing but mud. The porch light was still on. Grady parked crooked across the lot and didn't wait for anyone else. He swung the door open, cradled Amma with both arms, and ran toward the clinic like it was the last place on earth with breath left inside it. Helen answered the knock in her old flannel shirt and jeans, reading glasses still on her nose. She blinked like she'd just come out of a dream and wasn't sure yet if this was part of it. "I need your help," Grady said, voice low, soaked through. "Right now." She opened the door wider. They laid Amma on the metal table in the back room, under the only bulb that hadn't flickered out. Helen took one look at her and stopped breathing for half a second. Not because of what Amma was, but because of what she looked like. Pale, dehydrated, eyes rimmed in blue, pulse barely fluttering under the skin. Tal paced just beyond the table, low growl constant in his chest, but never louder than a warning. Helen didn't ask what she was. She didn't ask why the boy's arms looked like a man's and his face like something the world had forgotten. She just rolled up her sleeves and started. She worked fast, tubes, fluids. A small oxygen mask, jury-rigged from what she had for a Labrador retriever. Her hands didn't shake. Not once. "They've ingested something caustic," she murmured. "Smell that? Pesticide, maybe. Or old rodent bait. You said they were trapped under concrete." "Old lodge," Grady nodded. "Storage basement. God knows what they used in that place back then." Helen clicked her tongue and pushed a small vial into the drip. "Activated charcoal. It's not perfect, but it might slow the absorption." Amma didn't stir. Tal moved closer. Nina stepped between them and the table. "Back," she said gently. "Let her work." Tal stared at her like he was memorizing her heartbeat, then backed away. They worked in shifts. Grady held Amma's hand when the shivering got worse. Helen stitched 2 wounds along her thigh with shaking light. Riley cleaned the counters with bleach just to feel like he had something to do. Nina stood at the door with her ranger radio off, in case anyone in the town asked why the vet clinic hadn't answered. At one point, a knock hit the front door hard. A local rancher, thick-necked, holding a calf by a lead rope. "Sliced its leg on barbed wire," he said. "Needs stitches now." Helen didn't move. "There's an emergency in progress," Nina said, blocking the door with her shoulder. "You'll have to wait. It's livestock." "I don't care if it's the damn governor's cow. You'll wait." The man squinted past her shoulder. "The hell's going on back there?" Helen stepped up, calm and firm. "You can wait in the truck or come back tomorrow. Your choice." The man grumbled and backed off, but not without muttering something about how this town used to be run by people who knew what mattered. The door clicked shut again. They were back in the glow of that one flickering light bulb. Hours dragged. Amma's breath dropped to almost nothing. Then nothing. Grady stood frozen. Helen didn't even blink. She bent low, pressed 2 fingers under the jawline, then over the ribs. "She's not gone," she whispered. "Just slipping." Helen pressed her lips against the tiny mouth and exhaled. 3 times. She thumped the chest, light but sharp. Then again. Grady couldn't move, couldn't think. Amma's body jerked. A cough, small, broken, but alive. Helen fell back in her chair like someone had pulled the plug out of her spine. Grady exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. Tal let out a sound that was half whimper, half something older. Helen didn't speak for a while. Just stared at her hands. Then finally, quietly, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway." Grady sat down on the floor, back against the cabinet, knees drawn up like an old man trying to pray without asking for anything. He looked at Tal. The boy had settled in a corner now, keeping watch. Then he looked at Amma. He whispered something under his breath, something Nina overheard from across the room. "You got your mama's fight in you." The room went still again. Outside, the storm quieted. The hum of the town returned. Later, sometime near dawn, Grady stepped outside for air. The sky was starting to pale, a soft wash of blue over the hills. He lit a cigarette, held it between his fingers, unlit. He didn't smoke anymore, but the ritual steadied him. He stared out into the open dark and spoke not to the trees, not to the wind, but to a memory. "She lived, didn't she? 7 years, even after I shot her." He closed his eyes. "You gave her that time. You gave her those kids, and I wasn't there when she needed someone again. But I'm here now, and I swear, so help me, I'm not walking away this time." He opened his eyes. Nina had stepped out behind him, unnoticed. She didn't say a word. She just watched him. Watched the man who used to be a killer sit in the cold and ask forgiveness from a ghost no one else could see. And maybe for the first time, she saw him not as an old ranger with too many regrets, but as someone still paying his debt, breath by breath. Inside, Amma shifted. Tal placed a hand on her shoulder and lay down beside her. Helen adjusted the drip one last time, then turned off the overhead light. There was nothing else to do now. Just wait, and listen to the heartbeat of something the world had forgotten how to believe in. The morning rose slow, not triumphant, but quiet, careful. When Grady stepped back into the room, Amma looked at him, eyes half-lidded, weak. But she looked, and she didn't flinch. She just watched as he reached out a hand. Not a demand, not a threat, just there, She placed her palm against his, furred and small and warm, and for the first time in years, something inside him stopped shaking. They had survived the night, but the world would come knocking again soon. And next time, it wouldn't ask permission. The first night back at Grady's cabin, they didn't sleep. Not him. Not the creatures huddled in the wooden pen behind the house. Not the wind that rattled the rafters like it was trying to whisper something only the guilty could hear. He sat outside the enclosure, leaning against one of the fence posts he'd reinforced that afternoon with salvaged beams from the barn. He hadn't used nails, just rope and time. He didn't want anything to feel like a cage. They stayed tucked in the corner farthest from him. Amma pressed tight against Tal's chest. Their fur bristled with every gust of wind, every passing car 2 ridges away. They didn't cry. They didn't call. They watched. The whites of their eyes caught every flicker of lantern light like they were trying to memorize the shape of their new prison. Grady didn't try to speak. He just tapped a slow rhythm on the post behind him, the way he'd done on the floor at the lodge. Nothing loud, just a steady cadence. 3 beats, pause, 3 again, then silence. At some point, around 3 a.m., Amma moved. Just a twitch, a shudder. Tal reacted like he always did, protective, possessive. But when she didn't retreat, he settled again. Morning came gray and wet. Dew hung from the trees like breath caught in the branches. Grady stretched, joints cracking, lower back stiff from sleeping upright. He rose slowly, his hands aching as he opened the enclosure gate and slid a small tray inside. Slices of cooked rabbit, a mason jar of water. Nothing else. Then he backed away. By noon the meat was gone. The jar tipped over. The muddy prints in the corner told him everything he needed to know. They were eating. They were watching. And they hadn't tried to escape. Helen showed up just before sunset. She parked at the edge of the gravel drive and didn't step out right away. When she finally did, her face was unreadable, but her hands were full. Gauze, powdered formula, 2 small syringes for fluid. She didn't go to the pen. She handed everything to Grady without a word. He just nodded. 2 days passed before Nina returned. She carried a box of apples, 2 extra canteens, and a look that said she hadn't decided yet if this was brilliant or insane. "You named them yet?" she asked, arms crossed. "No." "Ghana?" "Not my right." She didn't argue. At dusk, Grady took to sitting on the ground again. Same spot by the fence. He didn't speak to them, but he didn't look away. Each evening, he brought something different. Cooked fish, berries, rainwater caught in a cedar bowl. Every time, he stepped back. Every time, they waited until he was gone to touch it. Until the 7th night, Amma stepped forward before he stood up. He didn't move, didn't breathe. She reached toward him, not to take food, but to touch the scar on his cheek. The thin, silver line left by a jagged tree branch a few years back. She brushed it gently, then pressed her hand to her own chest, right where the crescent-shaped fur grew from her ribs. He didn't need words. He felt the message in his bones. Same pain, same place. From then on, the distance changed. Not overnight, but piece by piece. Amma began approaching the fence during daylight. Tal remained further back, always watching, always calculating. But he didn't pull her away. Grady started leaving the gate unlatched. They never opened it, but they always noticed. Then came the twigs. Grady noticed them one morning. 2 rows of sticks arranged in the dirt just outside the pen. Each row pointed in a different direction. One angled toward the forest, the other toward the cabin. He smiled without meaning to. That evening, after clearing the dishes, he laid out the same 2 rows. Only this time, he bent both sets inward, like arrows pointing home. By morning, Tal had ripped them apart and rebuilt them, this time straighter, parallel, like 2 paths that didn't touch, but moved forward side by side. Grady didn't touch them again after that. The next breakthrough came during a storm, the kind that slammed into the valley without warning. Wind clawed the roof. Lightning crackled against the hills. Grady was heading to the enclosure to check on them when he heard it, screaming. Not from fear, from memory. From inside a dream Amma couldn't claw her way out of. He froze, heart lurching. Tal tried to calm her, but she thrashed, shrieking in a language made of grief and nightmare. Grady couldn't take it. He sat outside the fence, grabbed a metal pipe, and tapped the rhythm again. 3 beats, pause, 3 again. The noise slowed. Her breathing changed. By the time she woke fully, her hands clutched Tal's fur, and her eyes were dry. That night, Nina came by with soup and heard everything. "You made music with them?" she asked. "No, I just reminded her she's not alone." Nina watched him a long time, then looked toward the pen. "You think they'll ever forgive us?" He shrugged. "I don't know, but I think she already started." Later, when they were alone, Grady sat by the fire and wrote in the old notebook he hadn't touched in years. Not field notes, not patrol logs. Letters, one to his son, one to his wife. He wrote about the silence in Amma's eyes, about Tal's tension, about the way they both shook when a truck passed or when he spoke too fast. He wrote about the need to let go of guilt and hold on to something else. He didn't write their names, just called them what they were. 2 lives that shouldn't have made it out. 2 chances he'd never deserve, but would protect anyway. He never said it out loud, but Nina figured it out the day she found him kneeling in the pen. Not to feed, not to talk, just to sit. Tal let him that day. Didn't move, but didn't block him either. They were growing stronger, eating more, moving differently. Amma began stacking things. Rocks, pine cones, bark in spirals. Always the same shape. A curl, like a symbol, like something remembered from a place they couldn't return to. Tal began practicing movements. Low crouches, lunges, speed bursts between tree trunks behind the pen. Grady saw it immediately. Instinct, hunting posture, readiness. That was when the idea came. He brought it to Helen first. She refused outright. "They're safe here," she said. "We can study them, observe." "They're not specimens," Grady snapped. "They were born free." Helen folded her arms. "And you think you can teach them how to be wild again?" Grady looked at the window. The sky outside held a strange yellow light. "No, I can't teach them that. But I can remind them it was always theirs." He told Nina next. She didn't answer for a long time. "You're going to let them go," she finally said. "I'm going to give them the tools to leave. The choice is theirs." She stared. "And when they leave, what then?" He rubbed his chin. "Then I'll know I didn't break them a second time." She exhaled hard. "That's not what this is about, is it?" Grady looked at her, eyes worn, mouth set like stone. "This isn't about saving them. It's about being worth something when I go." Nina nodded slowly. "Then let me help." They scouted a valley. High elevation. 3 sides surrounded by rocky ridge, one open toward dense forest. A stream ran through the middle. Plenty of prey. No sign of hunters. Grady built fencing, not to contain, but to mark boundary. Just enough to offer security, not imprisonment. He brought tools, food, old gear. And he brought Amma and Tal. They didn't understand at first. The transition was hard. Tal tried to climb out more than once. Amma hid under the rock shelf the first 2 days. But by the end of the week, they began to move like they belonged. Grady watched every moment. He brought them raw meat and slowly reduced the portion. Watched them track rabbits. Watched them succeed. Watched them fail. Every day, he stayed a little further back. Every night he left earlier. Until one morning, he arrived with nothing. No food, no comfort. Just stood and watched. Amma approached, expecting a gift. He turned and walked away. She didn't call out, but her eyes didn't follow him the same way anymore. They stayed with Tal. Back in the truck, Grady sat a long time before driving. He'd made them strong. Now came the harder part, letting them believe they didn't need him. He would return again, one last time, with a blade, to cut away the collars, to set them free completely. But when that moment came, he wasn't sure if they'd even look back. And maybe that's how he'd know he'd done it right. The valley Grady chose sat like a cradle between the ridge lines. hidden on all sides but one, where the dense pine wood curved inward like a curtain pulled half shut. It took 3 weeks of quiet work to prepare it. No machinery, no unnatural scent. Just human hands, an old rope marking a boundary that felt more like respect than confinement. He didn't call it a pen. He called it the Hollow. And if the forest had a heart, it beat somewhere in this place. He watched Amma and Tal take their first steps into it from the shadow of the trees, boots still caked with river mud. Their fur had thickened over summer. The limp in Amma's gait was nearly gone. Tal, already tall, carried himself like a sentry more than a child. Grady had expected hesitation. Instead, they entered the clearing like ghosts returning home. He didn't follow. That first week, he stayed at the edge, keeping his distance, scribbling into his notebook, noting how Amma sniffed every low shrub, how Tal scraped bark off trees, tested his weight on the branches. They were cautious but not afraid. The wind shifted often, and when it did, Grady saw how their noses turned toward it first, always reading, always asking. The hollow held signs of prey. Rabbits scat near the blackberry thickets, a line of deer prints by the stream, raccoons, quail, even a fox den on the far edge, which Grady quietly cordoned off. He needed this space to be wild, not violent. Each day became a lesson, not spoken, but shown. He left scraps of raw meat tucked beneath fallen logs, smeared bait near animal trails, planted feathers by stream beds. He watched how Amma began to move in half circles, crouch low before leaping, how Tal widened his stride, started to flank her like they'd done to trap air instead of prey. Grady never clapped, never praised. That wasn't how they learned. He just showed up again the next day, a little further away, a little less present. The hunt came by accident. A fawn. Small, separated from its mother, lost or limping. It didn't matter. Amma spotted it first from the fern line. She froze. Tal sensed it immediately. And in that split second, without warning, they moved. No sound, just motion. Amma darted low, fast, sweeping behind the fawn like smoke. Tal stormed forward, a wall of muscle in full charge. Grady barely tracked them with his binoculars. It was over in under 15 seconds. No screaming, no panic. The fawn went down clean. Tal held its throat, not savagely, but firmly. Amma stood still, chest heaving. Then she looked toward the ridgeline. She knew he'd seen it. That night, Grady sat by the fire longer than usual. Not to celebrate, but because he knew now, deep in his bones, that they didn't need him to survive anymore. Not truly, but the world had other ways of reminding a man he wasn't done. He heard the engine before he saw the truck. Wide tires, cheap muffler, southern plates. 3 men inside, talking louder than they needed to. The kind of noise that tried too hard to belong. Grady stepped into the trailhead with his hand out, badge barely visible on his chest. "Afternoon," he said. They slowed, but didn't stop. "Private land beyond this trail," he added, voice sharper. "Sanctioned for research, no hunting allowed." The driver laughed. "You own the forest now, old man?" Grady didn't blink. "You turn that wheel around, or you answer to more than just me." The silence that followed was tense. One of the men in the back leaned out, tried to peer past Grady. He smelled like cheap chewing tobacco and impatience, but they turned. Slowly. The tires kicked dust toward Grady's boots as they left. Back in the hollow, Tal had seen everything. From high in the trees. Amma stood below him, eyes pinned to the place Grady had stood. That evening, Grady didn't enter the valley. He just sat, back against a stump, wind pressing through the needles overhead. The next few days, he stopped bringing food. They had to learn what the silence meant. At first, they searched, circling the clearing, sniffing the perimeter, testing the old spots where meat had once been. Then they returned to their habits. Hunt, watch, learn. Grady watched too. And then came the moment he'd rehearsed, but never wanted to live. He returned with a small bucket. The smell hit before the lid came off. Raw meat, still fresh. He approached the fence, slow, steady. Amma met him halfway, cautious but hopeful. Her eyes lit with something unspoken. He didn't speak either. He set the bucket down, then picked it up again and walked away. He heard it, her sound. Not quite a growl, not a whimper. It hit like betrayal. Then the thud. A stick, hurled from behind, struck the ground just inches from his boots. He turned. Amma stood behind the fence, jaw clenched. Tal loomed behind her. He didn't throw anything, but his gaze was colder than the ridgeline snow. Grady didn't apologize. That night, he didn't sleep. Not because of guilt, but because of what came next. The collars, simple leather bands he and Nina had crafted early on, just to help them tell the two apart from afar when they were still recovering. They weren't tight, they weren't tagged, but they were man-made, and they didn't belong in the forest anymore. He waited until dawn, packed the old knife in his belt, entered the hollow without food, without sound. They saw him coming, didn't move. Tal was first, stood tall, didn't flinch. Grady raised a hand, open, slow, then reached toward the buckle. His fingers brushed fur. The leather slipped free. Tal stepped back. Amma hesitated. Her eyes flicked between Grady and the tree line. Then she stepped forward. He knelt, undid the clasp. The band slid away. He set it in the dirt and didn't pick it up. When he stood, they stood too. Still, breathing steady. Then without warning, they turned. Not fast, not furious, just deliberate, and walked away. Not into the trees, not out of anger, but into the wild. The wind shifted. Grady watched their backs until they became part of the green, part of the blur. The man who once pulled a trigger now stood still, empty-handed, and didn't call after them. Because some bonds aren't meant to stay. They're meant to teach the world how to let go. But even then, his heart knew. They'd remember. And if the forest was kind, maybe one day they'd come back. Not to stay, just to show him they still could. The diner at Willow Flats hadn't changed much in 4 years. The neon sign still sputtered when the wind came down from the North Ridge, and the coffee still tasted like it had been brewed through an oil filter. But folks came anyway. It was the kind of place where the locals didn't mind the chairs squeaking or the pies being a day too old, as long as the waitress remembered your name and nobody asked too many questions. That afternoon, the place was quiet. A few men from the lumberyard ate in silence, their hands rough with pine sap and their faces red from windburn. Grady Larkin sat alone in the corner booth, his elbows resting on the Formica table, hands wrapped around a mug that hadn't been refilled in 20 minutes. He looked older now, slower in the way he moved, like his joints had started keeping secrets from the rest of him. But his eyes still watched everything, still knew when someone was about to say something worth hearing. It was Mac Doyle, the driver from Mason Timber, who broke the quiet. "Grady," he said, voice low. "You ever hear anything big moving near old Sycamore Trail?" Grady looked up without answering. Mac leaned across the counter, lowering his voice further. "Happened yesterday. I was hauling fence post up the ridge, just after mile marker 27, maybe quarter mile shy of where the old mill used to be. I see these two shapes standing off the trail. Tall, Grady. One bigger than me by 2 feet easy. Other one, leaner, kinda graceful. I slowed down, figured it might be elk or bear, until they turned and looked. No one else in the diner spoke, but Grady felt the shift. The listening. They didn't bolt, Mac said. Just stood there, staring, like they were waiting for something. And get this, when I came around the bend later, someone had dragged a deer carcass onto the road. Not fresh, maybe a day old. Almost like they wanted me to stop, or leave. Grady set his mug down gently. His fingers tapped the table once, then twice. "You sure it wasn't a prank?" he asked. Mac shook his head. "Too big, too still. I've seen every animal this forest's got, Grady. These weren't just animals." Grady didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, as if confirming something already buried deep inside him. Nina Alvarez came by that evening. She was taller now, Or maybe just stood taller. Wore the badge with less stiffness, more grounding. She parked her Forest Service truck next to Grady's rusting Chevy and leaned on the hood. "You heard Mac's story," she said. He nodded. "You think it's them?" His silence was enough. She crossed her arms. "What are you thinking?" "That maybe they're not just surviving out there," he said. "Maybe they're watching." "Watching what?" He looked toward the horizon, where the last of the sun was slipping behind the treetops. "To see if I still remember the way back." That night he packed slow. Just a canteen, his notebook, and a small hunting knife he hadn't unsheathed in years. No rifle, no bait, no compass. Nina stood in the doorway as he slipped on his jacket. "I should come," she said. He shook his head. "If they remember me, it has to be just me. If they don't..." She didn't finish the thought. He didn't need her to. He started down the old service road just before dusk. The trail was overgrown in places, rocks pushed loose from years of frost and thaw. The air held that stillness that only came when the forest didn't trust you yet, like it was holding its breath. Grady walked without hurrying, without pausing. Every sound mattered now. The crunch of soil, the distant call of a night bird, the hush of his own breathing. He reached the bend near the ridge where the trees split like a curtain, and he saw them, just like Mac said. Two figures, one taller than the other, both upright, both still. The wind shifted and carried his scent toward them. Old denim, cedar oil, a trace of tobacco he hadn't smoked in years. The scent of memory. They didn't move. Grady didn't either. Time slowed there, like the trees themselves bent inward to see what would happen next. Then the smaller one, Amma, stepped forward, just a few feet. The larger one, Tal, moved too, shifting slightly, placing himself between her and the man. A warning, a test. Grady didn't speak. He kept his hands visible, low by his sides. His heartbeat thudded against his ribs, but his breath stayed even. Emma tilted her head. Tal's eyes narrowed. Then, without a sound, Tal stepped aside. Not far, just enough. Amma walked to Grady slowly. Her shoulders were broader now. Her hair longer, matted in places, but still unmistakably hers. Her gaze held a depth no wild animal carried. The same gaze her mother had that night in the scope. She stopped in front of him, inches away, and inhaled. Then she lowered her head, not as submission, but as recognition. She pressed her brow to his chest, once. Then again. A single huff of breath escaped her. Grady didn't move. Then Tal stepped closer, towering now. Shoulders broad, arms thick with strength. He approached with measured pace, stopped beside his sister, and turned his head toward Grady. And then he leaned in, let his shoulder brush the man's. Grady raised a hand, slow, placed it gently on the boy's arm, and for a moment, he was back in that clinic 4 years ago, hearing the machines beep, watching Helen fight to keep Amma breathing. For a moment, he felt the floor of Sawtooth Lodge crack beneath his knees again, felt the weight of blood and forgiveness and a future he never deserved. They stayed like that, 3 figures in the clearing, not speaking, not needing to. Then Amma turned, looked toward the tree line. The deer trail waited beyond. She moved first, back toward the woods. Tal followed, but turned once more, eyes locking on Grady. They said everything without sound. We lived, you let us. We remember. Then they disappeared, not in haste, but with purpose. Grady stood there until night swallowed the trail. Then he turned back. His boots found the old road again, and for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel heavy, just grounded. At the truck, Nina waited, leaning against the driver's side, arms folded. She didn't ask. He didn't tell. But when he handed her the notebook, her hands trembled slightly. "They're still out there," he said, "and they're not hiding anymore." She nodded. "They know who they are now." The wind shifted again, this time warm, rustling the leaves just enough to feel like breath. And somewhere, deep in the trees behind them, a rhythm echoed. 3 beats! Pause. 3 again, and Grady smiled, not because he was proud, but because he had not been forgotten. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn. What remained was silence so heavy it pressed against the windows of the ranger station like an old secret finally demanding to be told. Grady sat on the wooden floor, arms wrapped around his knees, staring into the dying fire. Tal was curled near the hearth, one giant hand resting over his sister like a blanket made of memory and instinct. Amma was still breathing, shallow, uneven, but breathing. No one had spoken since the sun had risen. There was nothing left to say. The cabin smelled of blood and wood smoke and the metallic edge of old sorrow. Grady's radio was smashed on the floor, a casualty of Tal's arrival. The outside world was quiet, but not empty. Something had shifted, and it was coming. Grady stood slowly, every joint aching. Not from age, but from knowing too much. He moved toward the table where his old field journal lay open, the one he thought he'd never touch again. Pages fluttered in a soft breeze that wasn't there. He wrote just one sentence. "They are not what we thought." Amma stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and Tal's eyes snapped open. He leaned over her, forehead pressing gently to hers. She made a soft sound, half breath, half question, and Grady could feel the weight of centuries hanging in that single moment. It was the sound of a child waking up and not knowing where the world had gone while she slept. And then, something changed in the air. The trees outside creaked, not from wind, but from something older, something watching. Grady stepped to the window. A dozen figures moved silently through the tree line, tall, hulking, covered in snow-damp fur. Not marching, not hunting, moving like shadows that had remembered how to walk again. They came to a stop just beyond the clearing. Tal stood slowly, never taking his hand from Amma. A beat passed, then another. Then a figure stepped forward from the others. Not the largest, but the one with presence. An elder, perhaps. Or maybe something more primal than age. Her face was not fierce, not hostile. It was unreadable, worn and wise like bark carved by rain and time. Her eyes found Tal's, and then Grady saw it. Recognition. This wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning. Tal let out a low sound. Not quite a growl, not quite speech, but filled with meaning. The elder replied in kind, short, direct. And whatever it meant, Tal accepted it. He turned back to Grady, his eyes softer now. He knelt and gently lifted Amma into his arms, then turned to leave, but stopped at the door and looked back. There was something almost human in the hesitation, a kind of weight, like gratitude stuck in the throat of a creature that had no language left for it. Grady nodded. That was enough, and then they were gone. The clearing emptied as silently as it had filled. Grady stood there a long time, not moving, not blinking. The fire behind him had gone out. The cold settled in again. Not cruel this time, just final. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking, but not from fear, from memory. He packed his bag slowly, methodically. One knife, one flare. A piece of jerky wrapped in wax paper. A picture of his daughter, long faded. A letter from his ex-wife he never sent. And then, carefully, he tucked the journal inside, the last page still open. Then he opened the cabin door. Outside, the world was no longer the same. Nothing looked different, but everything was. He followed the trail of the creatures until the footprints blurred with wind and time. He walked for hours, then days. Somewhere near the edge of Elkhead Ridge, he found a broken camera. His camera, left in the snow like an offering. He picked it up. No film inside, but a single Polaroid tucked under a stone nearby. It was Amma, laughing, reaching toward something unseen. He didn't know how it got there, but he took it and kept walking. By the time he made it to the ranger outpost, search teams had already been dispatched. They swarmed him like flies, asking questions, flashing lights, pushing microphones in his face. He said nothing. They put him in a hospital room with white walls and warmer sheets. The doctors whispered words like hypothermia and hallucination. The sheriff asked if he wanted to press charges. Grady just smiled. For the first time in years, he smiled. Then he asked for paper and a pen. He wrote down everything, not the kind of everything that fits in police reports or textbooks. The kind that sits between the lines. The kind that doesn't explain anything, but somehow makes it all clear. He titled it, "We Were Once Like Them," and he mailed it to a P.O. box in Crescent City he hadn't used since '89. Then he vanished. Some said they saw him hiking alone near the Bitterroots. Others swore they spotted him at a general store near Three Rivers, trading stories for soup. A few said he was dead. But one boy, a local kid from McCall, claimed he met a quiet old man deep in the forest who taught him how to read animal tracks, how to stay still long enough to matter, and how to listen when the trees talk back. And when the boy asked the old man if Bigfoot was real, the man just winked and said, "Some questions are too important for answers." Years passed. The ranger station was converted into a nature museum. Tourists took photos beside a rusted old stove. A plaque on the wall read, "In memory of those who protected more than just trails." One day, a woman with silver hair walked in. She looked around like someone remembering a song she hadn't heard in decades. Then she saw the Polaroid, now framed near the entrance. She smiled and whispered, "You made it, little girl." No one knew who she was. But later that night, the caretaker found a journal left behind. The first line read, "She laughed, and the world became something worth saving." He turned the page and started to read. Out in the forest, near a ridge where the trees bent just slightly wrong, a child's laughter echoed. Soft, wild, free, and not quite human. Some stories are not meant to be solved, only carried. In the hush of the forest, where pine needles fall like forgotten prayers and wind slips through branches like old voices returning home, there are truths that do not need names. They simply are. The kind you feel when silence isn't empty, but full. When the world, for just a moment, stops demanding to be understood, and instead asks only to be felt. This story, like the ones passed down in quiet cabins and weather-worn journals, reminds us that what makes us human has never been flesh, nor language, nor the shape of our footprints. It's compassion. It's the choice, again and again, to reach across the unknown with kindness, even when we're afraid. Especially when we're afraid. Maybe the point was never to prove what walks out there in the woods. Maybe the real question has always been, when something different from us needs help, do we offer our hand or do we turn away? Because what we call wild is often just misunderstood, and what we call monstrous is often just lonely. There are lives we pass by without noticing. There are cries we never hear because we've stopped listening. But kindness changes that. It softens the hard edges of fear. It bridges the gaps between species, generations, worlds. And it leaves behind a trail, not of evidence, but of legacy. The kind that doesn't need to be believed to be real. Sometimes what matters most is not what was, or even what is, but who we choose to become when no one is watching. In the deepest parts of the forest, and the deepest parts of ourselves, there's still a chance to begin again. Not as beasts, not as enemies, but as beings capable of grace. So wherever you're watching from tonight, whether in a quiet apartment, a small town porch, or somewhere tucked between memory and wilderness, may you carry this story like a lantern. Let it glow quietly inside you. And when you come across someone, or something, different, may you remember, we all just want to be safe. We all just want to be seen. We all just want to be heard and loved for who we are beneath the noise. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. If this story touched something in you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from and what part of this journey stayed with you most. And if you believe the world still has room for stories like this, stories of empathy, mystery, and hope, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Together, we're building something rare, a community where kindness still echoes. And sometimes, that's all it takes, for the forest to answer back. Good night, dear listener. We'll meet again in the trees.